Okay, after purging the communists from the Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek leads a fairly successful series of military attacks called the Northern Expedition, and that's designed to take out the warlords, or at least a portion of the warlords that had caused so many problems in China. And again, these warlords, they're not ideological, they're usually not communist or nationalist. They're just people that are running their territory and they want to be left alone. But you really can't have a modern nation state if you've got regions that are being run by autonomous warlords. So after Chiang Kai-shek wipes out the communists and ends the First United Front, sends the communists into hiding, he leads a fairly successful expedition called the Northern Expedition, and gets a much firmer hold on China than Sun Yat-sen had ever had before. Now, he doesn't control all of China. He doesn't wipe out all the warlords. By the way, he doesn't wipe out the communists either. But it's just kind of, it had been it was much more stable than it had been, although it's never 100% stable. So by 1930, Chiang Kai-shek is in much better shape than Sun Yat-sen had ever been. He's driven the communists largely underground. He's attacked many of the most powerful warlords and defeated them, and he's able to establish nationalist rule over a greater portion of China than anyone else had before during this very, very turbulent period that we're talking about. Now, back to the rivalry between the communist and the communist and the nationalist. So once Chiang Kai-shek had defeated these warlords, what he tries to do is he tries to encircle and defeat the remaining communists. The communists they've been decimated, but they haven't been destroyed. And under the leadership of Mao Zedong, the communists reestablished themselves, and Chiang Kai-shek begins a campaign against the Communist Party army, which is never that big, but it's still seen as a serious threat from Chiang Kai-shek's point of view. Um, so the Chiang Kai-shek begins a series of 5 campaigns against the Communist Party army. He tries to encircle what the Chinese were calling the Chinese Soviet Republic. So the Chinese had actually created in an area west of Shanghai, northwest of Shanghai, an independent republic that was communist within the Chinese state. And of course, this was intolerable to Chiang Kai-shek. So his army, after it defeats the warlords in the Great Northern campaigns, it goes after the communists. It tries to encircle them. It builds fortifications around the Chinese position. And so suddenly, by 1934, the communists find themselves in a big hole. They're encircled by the Nationalist Army. And it looks like the Nationalist Army is going to close the circle and completely wipe out all the communists in China. So they're in this circle, they're encircled, they're trapped, and the communists do something very, very desperate. They spot the weak area of the encirclement. So the nationalists have circled the Chinese army, but the Chinese spot a weak area, and what they do is they flee. They do a breakout. Okay, they do a jailbreak, and it's about, we think about 85,000 troops and tens of thousands of more accompanying personnel do this breakout. They find the weak link in the Chinese nationalist encirclement. They break out to the north. It's very iconic. There it is. It's called the Long March. It becomes kind of the origin myth of the Chinese Party. If you can look at, I just brought it up and it was on the other podcast. Chinese propaganda, they still talk about the Long March and everyone's smiling in this picture. It was actually horrendous. It wasn't fun. 90% of the people that started on the Long March died before they reached their position, which they would maintain until 1945. Weapons and supplies were literally carried on men's back. The line of marchers stretched for miles. The communists usually marched at night because the nationalists, once they realized, it took them a while to realize it, that there had been this breakout, but once the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek realized that the Communist Party had broken their encirclement, they go after them. And during this era, this is when Mao Zedong, and I'll talk about him in more detail, and I probably will talk about him on Tuesday. He gains the leadership of the Communist Party, and the Long March ends on October 10th, 1935. By the way, I'm not going to test you on that. It just, what you need to know is the Long March starts in 34, the fall of 34, ends in the fall of 35. Um, by some estimates, only 8,000 of the marchers that began the journey finished the journey. It was a march of 4,000 miles. It crossed 24 rivers and 18 mountain ranges. The Long March, frankly, is pretty epic. But it did kill 90% of the communists that started out, and it ends with Mao Zedong being the undisputed head of the Communist Party. Take a look in Story. He's got a kind of a very basic map of the Long March. But here's the big point I want you to take from this. The Chinese communists never really break out of the area of north central China that they arrive at in the 1930s. That's why they're kind of sidelined during World War II. They're in a remote part of China. And that's why I think there's only one major military engagement between communist forces and the Japanese forces during World War II. So what happens during World War II? Because of the Long March, the Chinese, and they're able to take root in north central China, begin to reinforce, begin to mobilize, begin to create a society. Really, is what they're doing up there, a communist society. But they're on the sidelines for most of World War II. That's not to say that we're not going to run into the communists. We're not going to run into Mao Zedong. We will, but for most of World War II, the communists are sidelined, and they're not involved in much of the fighting against the Japanese, which turns out to be just a fantastic advantage for them because they're able to mobilize, they're able to grow their army, they're able to organize their society, create their government in this region, while Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are being bled white fighting the Japanese. So this turns out to be a huge advantage for the communists, and it's one of the reasons that they're able to defeat the nationalists after World War II, because they come out of the World War II much stronger than they had gone into World War II because they're on the sidelines. Whereas the nationalist government comes out of World War II much weaker than it did because it's the nationalist armies that are fighting the Japanese. So it's very, very ironic how it turned out that the Long March, although it almost ended the Communist Party, you had the seeds of the Communist Revolution, these 8,000 folks that had done this epic 4,000-mile walk that survived it. They go to this remote area of China, and they're able to set a deep root for communism in China that will flower after World War II.